It happened in full view of the crown, no warning, no containment. Prince Edward rose from his seat mid-rehearsal, eyes fixed, jaw set, and walked out of the coronation chamber as stunned aides froze in place. This wasn't a minor disagreement. It was a rupture. And what he had just discovered about his role would send shockwaves through the very structure of royal power. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The moment didn't arrive with raised voices or public confrontation. It came quietly, almost surgically, as if something long buried had finally surfaced at the worst possible time. Inside the carefully controlled environment of coronation rehearsals where every step is measured, every gesture rehearsed to perfection, this kind of disruption simply does not happen. And yet, reports suggest that what unfolded that day broke through layers of royal protocol that have stood unchallenged for generations. Those present would later describe a shift in the atmosphere that felt immediate and chilling, as though the weight of centuries had suddenly cracked under the pressure of a single revelation. At first, there was confusion. Senior aides exchanged glances, unsure whether to intervene or remain frozen in place. The structure of these rehearsals is built on precision, hierarchy, and absolute discipline, and any deviation from that order is treated as a matter of quiet urgency. But this was different. This wasn't a missed cue or a minor disagreement over positioning. This was a senior royal one known for discipline, restraint, and unwavering loyalty choosing to remove himself entirely. Insiders whisper that there had been subtle signs in the days leading up to this moment. Small adjustments. Quiet conversations cut short. A growing sense that something behind the scenes was not aligning with long-standing expectations. What makes this moment even more striking is the man at its center. Prince Edward has long been viewed as one of the monarchy's most reliable figures, steady, understated, and deeply committed to the institution. For decades, his role has been defined not by spectacle, but by consistency. He is not known for disruption. He is not known for defiance. And yet, in that single moment, he became both. Various interpretations of the scene suggest that he had only just become aware of a critical change, one that directly impacted his position within the coronation framework. A change that, according to those familiar with the inner workings of such events, would never be made lightly. Within minutes, the ripple effect began. Palace administrative channels reportedly activated with unusual Arabexine Arabicrat, Arabictane Arabicta, messages moving rapidly between senior officials. It is said that key figures were informed almost immediately, though the exact details of those communications remain closely guarded. What is clear, however, is that this was not treated as an isolated incident. The urgency, the speed, and the silence that followed all point to something far more significant, a development that carried implications beyond a single rehearsal room. And perhaps most telling of all was the atmosphere left behind. Witnesses describe it as unprecedented, a word rarely used within a system that prides itself on continuity and control. The carefully constructed rhythm of the rehearsal had been broken, replaced by an uneasy stillness that no one seemed prepared to address. Because in that moment, it became clear that something fundamental had shifted and that whatever had triggered this reaction was not going to remain hidden for long. But this wasn't just about a rehearsal, it was about a role that had been quietly rewritten behind palace doors. For decades, his place had been unquestioned, carefully earned through loyalty, silence, and service. But as details began to surface, it became clear that Prince Edward had walked into that rehearsal expecting one thing, discovered something entirely different. What made that realization so powerful wasn't just the change itself, it was everything that came before it. For years, Edward had built his position not through spectacle or public acclaim, but through a kind of disciplined restraint that few others in the royal structure could sustain. He was never the loudest presence in the room, never the figure chasing headlines or commanding attention. Instead, he became something far more valuable to the institution, a constant. A figure who could be relied upon when others faltered, a steady hand in moments of transition, a presence that didn't need to be announced to be understood. And in a system where hierarchy is everything, that kind of quiet authority carries its own weight. Those familiar with the inner workings of the monarchy often describe roles not just as ceremonial duties, but as reflections of trust. Positions are not handed out lightly. They are earned over years, sometimes decades. of unwavering commitment. And Edward's path had followed that exact pattern. From his early years of service to his gradual rise within the royal framework, every step had reinforced a singular narrative: that he was dependable, measured, and deeply aligned with the values of the crown. It's why many insiders had long assumed his place in events of this magnitude was secure, almost immovable. The coronation itself was never just another ceremony. It represented continuity, legacy, and visible structure of power within the monarchy. Every role within it is carefully designed, each position carrying symbolic meaning that reaches far beyond the moment. For Edward, the expectations weren't simply personal, they were institutional. Historical precedents had established a clear pattern for where someone of his standing would be positioned, what responsibilities he would hold, and how his presence would reinforce the broader narrative of unity within the royal family. These were not assumptions built on speculation. They were grounded in tradition, reinforced over generations, and rarely altered without significant reason. But somewhere between expectation and execution, something changed. Reports suggest that adjustments to the coronation structure had been made quietly, without the kind of transparency that typically accompanies decisions of this scale. And while such changes are not unheard of, the way this one surfaced abruptly, without warning, and in the middle of rehearsal suggests something far more deliberate. It wasn't just that Edward's role had been reduced, it was that the reduction had been positioned in a way that left no room for interpretation. No gradual transition. No prior discussion. Just a sudden shift that redefined his place in a moment that was meant to affirm it. And that's where the emotional weight truly begins to take hold. Because for someone like Edward, this wasn't simply about ceremony. It was about recognition, about acknowledgement of years spent operating within a system that demands loyalty above all else. To see that recognition altered quietly, decisively cuts deeper than any public disagreement ever could. Insiders whisper that the shock wasn't just visible in his reaction, but in the silence that followed it. A silence that spoke to something unspoken, something that had perhaps been building beneath the surface for longer than anyone had realized. What complicates the picture even further is timing. This wasn't a distant adjustment made months in advance. It appeared at the exact moment when expectations were at their highest, when the structure of the coronation was being finalized and rehearsed in its most complete form. And in that moment, the contrast between what had been anticipated and what was presented became impossible to ignore. It forced a confrontation not loud or chaotic, but deeply personal and undeniably real. Because what he discovered wasn't an oversight, it was a deliberate shift, and someone had approved it. The decision hadn't been announced. It hadn't even been discussed publicly. Yet somehow, the script had changed and King Charles III was already aware. That realization didn't arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, like a truth that had been carefully concealed until it could no longer be contained. In a system where every ceremonial detail is mapped out months in advance, last-minute alterations are not just unusual, they are deeply disruptive. Yet, reports suggest that adjustments to the coronation rehearsal had been made with a level of urgency that bypassed the usual channels. Not openly declared, not formally explained, but quietly inserted into the structure as if they had always been there. Those familiar with palace operations often describe a layered communication system, one where information flows through controlled pathways, each step documented, each change justified. But this time, something felt different. Insiders whisper that certain instructions were issued with unusual discretion, limiting who could access the full scope of the revisions. Words like restricted and confidential began to surface in internal exchanges, signaling a level of containment that raised more questions than it answered. Why would a ceremonial adjustment require that degree of secrecy? Why would a change affecting a senior royal figure be handled without the transparency typically expected at that level? At the center of it all was timing. The shift didn't occur weeks before the rehearsal, when adjustments can still be absorbed into the broader structure. It emerged at the precise moment when everything was supposed to be finalized, when positions were no longer theoretical, but fixed. That timing alone suggests intention. It implies that the change was not merely logistical, but strategic, introduced at a point where it would be seen, felt, and impossible to ignore. And perhaps more importantly, a moment where it could not easily be reversed. speculation quickly turned toward the question no one could answer openly: who initiated it? In a monarchy defined by hierarchy, decisions of this magnitude rarely originate from a single source. They are shaped, influenced, and ultimately approved through a chain of authority that reflects the delicate balance of power within the institution. Some interpretations suggest that this was part of a broader recalibration, an effort to redefine roles in a way that aligns with shifting priorities at the highest level. Others hint at something more personal, a decision influenced by internal dynamics that have remained hidden from public view. What complicates matters further is the reported awareness at the very top. The fact that King Charles III was already informed, or perhaps even involved, adds a layer of gravity that cannot be ignored. Because if this change carried his knowledge, then it was not accidental. It was sanctioned. And in a system where authority flows from the crown itself, that distinction changes everything. It transforms a procedural adjustment into a deliberate act, one that carries both symbolic and structural consequences. Meanwhile, palace aides found themselves navigating an increasingly tense environment. Instructions to contain information only heightened the sense of unease. Conversations became shorter, more guarded. Details were shared selectively, if at all. The usual rhythm of preparation, methodical, transparent, predictable, was replaced by something far more uncertain. A controlled silence that suggested not just caution, but concern. And at the center of that silence was the unanswered question of why. Why alter a role that had long been established? Why do it in this way at this time under these conditions? The lack of clarity didn't just create confusion, it created tension. A sense that something larger was unfolding beneath the surface. Something that extended beyond a single rehearsal or a single decision. Because when a change like this is made quietly, it rarely stays quiet for long. It lingers, it builds, it demands a response. And in this case, that response had already begun to take shape, swift, unmistakable, and impossible to contain. But if the change was quiet, the reaction was anything but. Witnesses say the shift in the room was instant, like something had snapped. Prince Edward didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply stood and left. What makes that moment so powerful isn't what was said, but what wasn't. Because inside that silence, something irreversible had already taken place. According to those familiar with the rehearsal sequence, Edward had been reviewing updated documents just moments before the break. Routine, structured, expected. But as his attention moved across the details, something didn't align. A subtle inconsistency at first, then a pattern, and finally, a realization that cut through everything he had come to expect from this institution. It wasn't dramatic on the surface. There was no confrontation, no immediate demand for explanation. But insiders suggest that the clarity came quickly, almost with a cold precision. The role he had prepared for the position, shaped by years of precedent, by decades of service, had been altered, reduced, repositioned in a way that fundamentally changed its significance. And the way it was presented left no ambiguity. This wasn't a temporary adjustment. It was a redefinition. For a brief moment, those around, he seemed to sense it without fully understanding it. A shift in posture. A stillness that felt heavier than the room itself. The kind of silence that doesn't invite interruption because it signals something final. Palace coordinators, trained to maintain order in even the most complex situations, reportedly hesitated. Not because they didn't know what to do, but because they understood, instinctively, that this was not a situation they could control. And then, without hesitation, he moved. Announcement. No attempt to draw attention. Just a deliberate decision to remove himself entirely from the process. That alone was enough to send a wave of uncertainty through the entire operation. Because in a system built on predictability, even the smallest deviation is felt immediately. And this was not small. This was a senior royal walking away from a moment that had been carefully constructed over months, perhaps years of preparation. What followed was immediate, though not chaotic in traditional sense. It was controlled urgency. Aides exchanging quick, quiet words. Schedules being reviewed. Communications beginning to move through internal channels with increasing Arabexine, Arabecrit, Arabecta. There was no public acknowledgement, but the impact was undeniable. The rhythm of the rehearsal had been broken, replaced by a tension that no one seemed willing to address directly. Perhaps the most telling detail of all was the absence of resistance. No one stepped forward to stop him. No one attempted to intervene. And in a place where hierarchy dictates action, that silence speaks volumes. It suggests recognition. An understanding that whatever had just happened could not be resolved in that moment within that space. That it required something else, something beyond the controlled environment of a rehearsal room. As he exited, the implications began to take shape. Not immediately, not fully, but enough to signal that this was not an isolated reaction. It was the visible result of something deeper, something that had been building beneath the surface long before that document was placed in front of him. And now, for the first time, it had surfaced in a way that could no longer be ignored. Because when a figure like Prince Edward chooses silence over confrontation, departure over compliance, it forces a question that cannot be easily dismissed. What was important enough, serious enough to trigger that response? And more importantly, who understood the consequences before it even happened? And within minutes, word had reached the highest level of the monarchy. Phones started ringing before he even left the grounds. By the time King Charles III was informed, the situation had already escalated beyond containment. What began as a silent departure quickly transformed into something far more volatile behind closed doors. Within seconds of Prince Edward stepping away, the tightly controlled rhythm of the rehearsal fractured into a state of controlled chaos. Not loud, visible but unmistakable. Communications surged through internal channels with unusual urgency, messages relayed in clipped, careful language. Each one carrying the weight of a moment that no one had prepared for. This was not standard protocol. This was response mode. Emergency discussions were triggered almost instantly, though they did not unfold in a single room or through a unified voice. Instead, they emerged in fragments, small clusters of senior aides attempting to assess the situation. From different angles, each one working with incomplete information. Reports suggest that some believed the issue could still be contained quietly, managed through internal clarification and swift adjustments. Others, however, sensed something far more serious, something that had already crossed a line that could not easily be reversed. That divide, subtle at first, began to shape the response itself. Efforts to reach Edward reportedly began within moments, but the tone of those attempts revealed a deeper uncertainty. This wasn't simply about calling him back to resume a rehearsal. It was about understanding whether he would return at all. Insiders whisper that messages were sent carefully, deliberately, avoiding language that might escalate the situation further. Because by that point, it was clear that this was no longer a procedural issue. It had become personal. And once that boundary is crossed within the monarchy, resolution becomes far more complex. At the same time, another layer of concern began to surface, one that extended beyond the palace walls. Fragments of the incident had already started to move outward, reaching individuals with close ties to media networks and royal correspondence. Not full details, not confirmed narratives, but enough to raise questions. And in a landscape where even the smallest hint of internal disruption can trigger widespread speculation, that alone was enough to set alarm bells ringing. Palace officials are known for their ability to control information with precision, but this time, the speed of the situation threatened to outpace that control. Containment efforts intensified. Conversations became more guarded, instructions more precise. The priority shifted rapidly from understanding what had happened to ensuring that it did not become public knowledge, at least not in its raw, unfiltered form. Because the optics of a senior royal walking out of a coronation rehearsal carry implications that extend far beyond a single moment. They challenge the image of unity, stability, and continuity that the monarchy works tirelessly to maintain. And once that image is questioned, the consequences can be difficult to contain. Meanwhile, concern about perception began to grow, not just within the palace, but among those who understand how these moments are interpreted by the outside world. The narrative, if it were to emerge, would not be about rehearsal logistics or internal adjustments. It would be about conflict, about division, about a breakdown in the very structure that the coronation is meant to reinforce. And that realization added a new layer of urgency to every decision being made behind the scenes. Because beneath the surface of every conversation, every attempt at control, there was a growing recognition that this situation was no longer confined to a single room or a single decision. It had already begun to reshape perceptions, to shift dynamics, to expose tensions that had previously remained hidden. And once those tensions are revealed, even in fragments, they take on a momentum of their own. Because behind the scenes, this wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was a power shift. What looked like a simple role adjustment was, according to insiders, something far more strategic, a recalibration of influence at the highest level of the crown. Because within the monarchy, nothing exists in isolation. Every ceremonial position, every moment of visibility, every carefully assigned role carries weight far beyond its surface meaning. What appears to the outside world as tradition is, in reality, a finely balanced structure of influence, one where even the smallest shift can signal a deeper realignment. And in this case, the sudden reduction in visibility for Prince Edward was not being interpreted as coincidence. It was being read as a message. Insiders familiar with royal operations often describe ceremonial authority as a kind of currency, subtle but powerful. Who stands where? Who speaks when? Who is seen and who is not? These decisions shape perception, and perception, in turn, shapes power. By adjusting Edward's role at such a critical moment, the structure itself was being altered. Not dramatically, not in a way that would immediately disrupt the public narrative, but just enough to create a shift that those within the system could not ignore. And that's where the deeper stakes begin to emerge. There has been growing speculation that this change may be tied to the elevation of other figures within the royal framework, not in a way that openly displaces one individual, but in a manner that redistributes presence and influence across the broader structure. This is how the monarchy often adapts quietly, incrementally, without direct confrontation. But the timing of this adjustment, and the way it was introduced, suggests something more deliberate. Something designed not just to adjust roles, but to redefine the balance itself. At the heart of this recalibration lies the question of internal alignment. The monarchy is not a single unified force, it is a network of relationships, loyalties, and long-standing dynamics that must constantly be managed. Reports suggest that in recent months, there have been subtle shifts in how those dynamics are being navigated. Decisions that once followed predictable patterns now appear more fluid, more responsive to changing priorities. And within that context, Edward's reduced role begins to take on a different meaning, not as an isolated decision, but as part of a broader strategy. What makes this particularly significant is the symbolism attached to visibility. For someone like Prince Edward, whose reputation has been built on quiet service rather than public prominence, even a slight reduction in ceremonial presence carries weight. It signals a repositioning, a subtle redefinition of where he stands within the hierarchy. And in a system where perception often matters as much as reality, that signal does not go unnoticed. It is observed, interpreted, and quietly discussed among those who understand its implications. The debate among insiders reflects this uncertainty. Some view the change as a necessary adjustment, part of an ongoing effort to modernize and streamline the monarchy's public image. Others see it as something more calculated, a move designed to shift influence in ways that are not yet fully visible. And then there are those who believe it may be both at once. A practical decision shaped by deeper strategic considerations that extend beyond the immediate moment. What remains clear, however, is that the long-term implications cannot be ignored. Changes at this level do not simply fade away. They ripple outward, affecting future decisions, shaping expectations, and redefining relationships within the royal structure. And once that process begins, it rarely reverses itself. It evolves, it expands, and it eventually reveals its full impact over time. If this was intentional, then someone had made a calculated move. Behind the polished image of unity, something deeper had been building, and this moment may have exposed it completely. For years, the monarchy has presented itself as a structure of unshakable cohesion, a carefully maintained balance where tradition and duty override personal differences. But those familiar with its inner workings understand that beneath that composed surface, tensions can simmer quietly, sometimes for months, sometimes for years. And in recent times, reports suggest that subtle fractures had begun to form, small, almost imperceptible at first, but gradually widening as priorities shifted and expectations evolved. These were not public disputes or dramatic confrontations. They were quieter than that. Conversations left unfinished. Decisions that felt slightly out of alignment. A growing sense that the old certainties were no longer as stable as they once seemed. At the center of this shifting landscape stood Prince Edward, a figure whose entire role within the monarchy had been defined by loyalty. Not loud, not performative, but deeply rooted in the idea that service comes before recognition. For decades, that approach had positioned him as one of the institution's most reliable figures, a constant in a system that often faces change. But loyalty, when tested against shifting priorities, can become something more complicated. It can create a tension between what has always been expected, what is suddenly being redefined. And that tension, according to insiders, had been quietly building long before the rehearsal incident brought it into focus. There have been whispers of disagreements in recent months, not open disputes, but differences in direction that have shaped decisions at the highest level. The monarchy, like any institution, must adapt. It must respond to changing circumstances, evolving public expectations, and internal realities that are not always visible from outside. But adaptation often comes with consequences. It requires choices. And those choices, no matter how carefully managed, inevitably affect the people within the system. In Edward's case, those effects appear to have reached a point where silence was no longer sustainable. The dynamics among senior royals have also been shifting in ways that are difficult to fully define but impossible to ignore. Influence is not static. It moves, adjusts, responds to both internal pressures and external realities. And as that movement occurs, roles are reassessed, responsibilities are redistributed, and the balance that once felt stable begins to evolve. For some, this process is gradual, almost seamless. For others, it arrives as a moment of sudden clarity, a realization that their place within the structure is no longer what it once was. That realization carries an emotional weight that cannot be dismissed. For Prince Edward, this was not simply about ceremony or visibility. It was about identity within an institution that has shaped his entire life. To see that identity altered quietly, without acknowledgement, creates a conflict that goes beyond protocol. It becomes deeply personal. And when that personal dimension intersects with public duty, the result is rarely simple. It becomes layered, complex, and often unresolved. Perhaps that is why the decision to walk out resonates so strongly. Because in a system that values restraint above all else, silence is often the default response. To remain, to adapt, to accept that is the expectation. But to leave, even without words, is to break from that pattern. It is a statement not through confrontation but through absence. And that absence speaks louder than any argument could. It forces attention. It demands interpretation. It challenges the narrative of unity that the monarchy works so carefully to maintain. Because what happens next won't just affect a rehearsal, it could reshape the coronation itself. The doors close behind him, but the echo of that moment hasn't faded. And now, the crown faces a question it can't ignore. Because what followed was not immediate clarity, but a growing uncertainty that began to spread through every layer of the institution. The absence of Prince Edward was no longer confined to a single rehearsal. It became a looming question over everything that came next. Would he return? Would his role be restored, redefined, or quietly removed altogether? Insiders suggest that even those closest to the decision-making process were left navigating possibilities rather than certainties. And in a system built on precision, that kind of uncertainty carries its own weight. Discussions reportedly shifted from reaction to recalibration. If one role could change so abruptly, what else might follow? The coronation, once seen as a fixed structure, suddenly appeared more fluid, more vulnerable to revision than anyone had anticipated. Adjustments that might once have been considered minor now carried deeper implications, forcing those in charge to reconsider not just individual positions, but the overall balance they were trying to present. Because every alteration, no matter how small, risks sending a message, and in this case, that message was already being interpreted in ways that could not be easily controlled. Pressure began to build quietly, steadily. Not in public statements or official announcements, but in the spaces where decisions are shaped and narratives are formed. There was a growing awareness that silence could not be maintained indefinitely. At some point, clarification would be required. A response, however measured, would need to address what had happened or risk allowing speculation to define it instead. And speculation, once it takes hold, has a way of expanding beyond its original scope. drawing in interpretations that can reshape perception far more dramatically than the truth itself. At the same time, the potential for public reaction loomed in the background. For now, the details remained contained, circulating only in fragments among those close to the story. But if those fragments were to align, if the full picture were to emerge, the narrative would be difficult to manage. A senior royal walking out of a coronation rehearsal is not a minor detail. It is a moment that invites scrutiny, raises questions, and challenges the carefully maintained image of unity that defines the monarchy's public presence. And once that image is questioned, the effects can extend far beyond the event itself. What makes this moment particularly significant is its symbolic weight. The monarchy is built on continuity, on the idea that tradition holds firm even as the world around it changes. Acts of defiance, especially those that occur within its most structured ceremonies, are rare. When they do happen, they are not easily forgotten. They become part of the narrative, part of the history that shapes how the institution is understood. In this case, the decision to walk away quiet, controlled, but unmistakable carries a meaning that cannot be reduced to a single explanation. It speaks to a tension between duty and recognition, between loyalty and change. It reflects a moment where the balance shifted just enough to become visible, where something long held beneath the surface finally broke through. And as the monarchy moves forward, that moment will not simply disappear. It will remain, influencing decisions, shaping perceptions, and reminding those within the system that even the most stable structures can be tested. Because in a monarchy built on order, even a single walkout can reveal fractures that no ceremony can conceal. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.